wants to be intelligent until they understand what it truly means. Because intelligence isn't just being able to solve problems or speak eloquently. It's being able to see through people, through systems, through the carefully constructed illusions that most depend on to function. At first it feels like a gift. You notice patterns others miss. You anticipate outcomes they never considered. You read between the lines, not just in conversation, but in life itself. But here's the silent curse. The more you see, the more you understand how little others do. The sharper your mind becomes, the more distant you feel from the world around you. Conversations begin to lose flavor. Jokes that make others laugh fall flat to you, not because you lack humor, but because you see the layers of pain or projection behind the laughter. Advice that others find comforting rings hollow in your ears. You nod, you smile, you play along. But deep down, you know you're not truly with them. You're beside them, observing. This is the beginning of a quiet exile, not one imposed by others, but one that emerges from within. The realization dawns slowly, like a fog rolling over your sense of belonging. Being intelligent doesn't make you part of the group, it makes you other. And while the world applauds intellect in theory, in practice, it often rejects what it doesn't understand. The more clearly you speak, the less people want to listen. The more truths you reveal, the more uncomfortable they become. And so your reward for clarity is isolation. It's not a dramatic separation. There's no moment of banishment, just a gradual fading. You stop being invited. You stop sharing what's on your mind. You learn to silence yourself, not because you lack the words, but because you know they won't land. The curse of intelligence isn't just the burden of knowledge. It's the ache of invisibility, the agony of being surrounded by people and still feeling alone. Because intelligence, when unshared and unreceived, becomes a weight you carry by yourself. It doesn't happen all at once. At first it's subtle, almost unnoticeable. You're in the middle of a conversation, and while everyone is laughing or nodding in agreement, you're elsewhere. Not physically, but mentally. You've already seen where the conversation is going, sensed the contradiction in someone's logic, felt the emptiness behind their words, and suddenly, you're not part of the moment anymore. You're watching it from above, detached, analyzing the behavior of people who don't even know they're being observed. As your intelligence sharpens, so does your awareness. You begin to notice patterns that others miss, the inconsistencies in people's beliefs, the social performances they engage in, the small lies they tell themselves to survive the day. You see manipulation camouflaged as kindness, weakness dressed up as virtue, and ignorance parading as certainty. At first you try to ignore it. You want to stay connected, but the more you notice, the harder it becomes to participate. What once felt like friendship now feels like an endurance test. Small talk drains you. Surface-level connections bore you. Conversations that orbit weather, gossip, or blind consensus start to feel like static noise in a brain wired for depth. You begin to realize that your mind is not just different, it's heavier, more demanding, and far less compatible with the world that surrounds it. You try to bring others into your world, share an insight, offer a deeper perspective, but the reactions are always the same: confusion, discomfort, dismissal. People don't want to think that deeply. They don't want to be reminded of the illusions they depend on. And so they retreat. Or worse, they make you the problem. Too serious, too intense, too much. You begin to edit yourself, not out of dishonesty, but out of necessity. And this is where the real fracture begins. The moment you realize that being fully yourself means being misunderstood, or entirely alone, there comes a moment when the weight of perception becomes unbearable. Not because the world has changed, but because your lens has. You no longer see people as they present themselves, but as fragmented mirrors of fear, desire, delusion, and contradiction. Conversations become performances. Smiles hide silent battles. Compliments conceal subtle power plays. And as your awareness sharpens, something else starts to dull: your ability to connect. You begin to realize that intelligence is not just about understanding information. It's about noticing the subtext in a person's tone, the discomfort behind their laugh, the lie they've repeated so often it has calcified into their identity. And once you see these things, you can't unsee them. You can't return to innocence. You can't participate in the small rituals of ignorance that most people call relationships. This is not loneliness in the ordinary sense. It's a form of psychological exile. You are surrounded by people, yet you feel like an outsider looking in, watching a world that no longer speaks your language. Even when you try to share what you see, what you feel, the responses come back hollow. Confused smiles, nervous laughter, quick topic changes. You become the deep friend, the overthinker, the one who always takes things too seriously. The collapse doesn't happen all at once. It unfolds slowly, like erosion. 1,000 tiny moments where you swallow your thoughts to keep the peace, where you pretend you don't notice the contradiction in someone's words, where you nod along, to avoid the exhausting dance of explaining yourself for the 10th time. Over time, these compromises accumulate into a kind of inner silence, a retreat, not just from others, but from yourself. And then it hits, the crushing realization that no one truly knows you, not because you're hiding, but because they don't have the capacity or the desire to see. You're not mysterious, you're just inconvenient. You carry truths that disrupt comfort, and in a world addicted to ease, that makes you a threat. And so, you begin to wonder if intelligence is a gift at all, or simply a curse that strips you of belonging while offering no sanctuary in return. That is the breaking point. Not the absence of others, but the absence of resonance. A void not of noise, but of meaning. And in that void, your mind screams for someone, anyone, to understand. But all you hear is the echo of your own thoughts, bouncing back at you in a chamber built from awareness, complexity, and silence. At some point, the weight of constant misalignment becomes unbearable. It's not a dramatic breaking point, not a loud scream into the void. It's quieter than that. A slow erosion of your willingness to explain yourself, to fit into rooms that can't contain your thoughts, to keep watering relationships that never had the roots to support your depth. And so, the withdrawal begins, not out of bitterness, but out of necessity. It is not a retreat, it is a recalibration of your energy, your boundaries, your peace. You start to realize that most of the noise in your life wasn't coming from the outside world, but from your own refusal to let go of it. The constant attempt to be understood, to be seen, to be reached becomes a form of self-harm. And so, you begin to withdraw, not with anger, but with clarity. You stop explaining your silences, you stop apologizing for your solitude, and you stop chasing conversations that only leave you emptier than before. In that silence, something unexpected begins to grow. A stillness, a strange sense of power. Without the exhausting need to adapt or translate your mind for others, your thoughts become sharper, more coherent, more complete. You find yourself drawn to books instead of crowds, to nature instead of parties, to contemplation instead of validation. You discover that solitude, when chosen rather than forced, is not loneliness, it is liberation. And slowly, the bitterness fades, not because the world finally understood you, but because you stopped needing it to. You no longer seek reflection in others to confirm your worth. Instead, you begin to forge an inner world so rich, so complex, that the absence of external understanding no longer feels like a loss, it feels like protection. In walking away, you didn't lose connection, you gained self-possession. The silence feels like punishment. The rooms you once filled with laughter and effortless connection now echo with your own thoughts. And yet, something unexpected begins to take form within that quiet. For the first time, you're no longer performing. No longer diluting your thoughts to be palatable. No longer shrinking your vision to fit inside someone else's limited frame. The isolation that once felt like a cage slowly reveals itself as an incubator. Not for ego, not for superiority, but for clarity, for sovereignty. You begin to realize that the loneliness was never a consequence of being broken. It was the side effect of being awake in a world that sleepwalks. Most people aren't rejecting you. They're rejecting the discomfort that your presence stirs within them. They don't want to see what you see, because to see it would mean they can no longer unsee it. And while that used to hurt, now it liberates you. You stop needing their understanding like a drug you were once addicted to. This is where the true advantage of intelligence reveals itself. Not in being praised, accepted, or followed, but in being able to build your own mental fortress. You no longer borrow meaning from the world around you. You construct your own. You become immune to surface-level chaos because you've learned how to operate in the depths. Intelligence, when isolated, becomes dangerous, not in its arrogance, but in its quiet self-mastery. So, if you find yourself alone, not because you've failed, but because you've outgrown the illusions, understand this: you were never meant to fit in. You were meant to see, and those who see too much must walk a lonelier road, but that road leads to something that most will never touch: freedom, in its purest and most untouchable form. Here's the truth that no one tells you. Intelligence isolates not because it makes you better, but because it makes you aware. Aware of the lies, the masks, the unspoken games. Aware of how most people live on autopilot, addicted to illusions, terrified of depth. And when you refuse to play that game, when you begin to think for yourself, speak the unspeakable, and see what others pretend not to, you become a mirror they can't stand to face. That's why they withdraw. That's why you feel like you don't belong. But here's the final revelation. You were never meant to belong in the shallow. Your isolation is not a flaw. It's a function, a signal, a rite of passage for those who are awake enough to carry the burden of truth. So stop apologizing for your clarity. Stop dimming your mind just to feel accepted by those who fear their own reflection. You weren't made to fit into a broken system. You were made to outgrow it, to rise above it, to build something that doesn't yet exist. If this message hits somewhere deep, it's because you know it's true. Now do something with it. Leave a comment, share the truth you've been hiding, and subscribe, because this space isn't for everyone. It's for those who see. And if you're still watching, you already know. You're one of us. Stay sharp, stay sovereign, and never forget, clarity is a lonely gift, but it's still a gift.